Chapter 18. Decision. The prince turned back and stared blankly at the fire. His brother was coming. Somehow, Ramael was coming straight toward him. He opened his mouth to say something to Damaz, to warn him so that he could warn the other kindred in turn and they could ready a defense. But no words came out. And after a moment or two of sitting there, jaw hanging loose, he closed his mouth and stayed silent. He went through the rest of the night in a strange kind of mental twilight, not giving any particular thought to what he was doing or saying. He remembered vaguely Tomaz telling him more about rangers, who scouted the mountain border and made their way up and down the empire lending help to anyone who found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Through it all, he nodded, smiled politely at the right times, and kept silent. Soon after the stew was finished, they both turned in to sleep. Tomaz went to his corner room and the enormous bed contained therein, while the prince made do with the couch and the large animal skin blankets there. He did not sleep that night. He didn't even doze. He lay there, feeling the glow of life 20, 30 times what a single man should give off, coming from his brother, far off but drawing closer, even in the night. And as the light grew, so did his anger and his resentment. Anger at who? He didn't know. The boiling, sickly feeling that had formed in the pit of his stomach churned and became a seed that slowly sprouted, directionless. His resentment, though, was reserved for the kindred. Why should he warn them? He held no loyalty to them. They had successfully defended themselves for over 1,000 years, safe here behind their enchantments. If they were so great, then let them defend themselves. And, truly, he knew that David would give him up. He knew that Leah and Tomaz, no matter their talk about choices, would too, in the end. He was just too valuable to let go. The kindred needed the information he had about the Empire, the Empress, the fortress itself, in order to continue and possibly turn the tide of their ongoing war. And they would get it, no matter the cost. He knew they would. People who would risk the starvation of common citizens in order to prevent the growth of an army would care little about his single, unimportant life. And so he felt no guilt about letting them face this threat alone. As for his brother, let him come. If Ramael tried to take the prince back to Lucien, back to the capital city and to his mother, then maybe he would go. Having delivered her the 7th principality by infiltrating it as no other member of the empire had been able to do since the beginning of the war, perhaps that would earn him his freedom, and his life. That was certainly something she couldn't easily ignore. But he didn't want that either, he realized. Not truly. It would be, perhaps, the easiest option. He could solidify it by seeking out the elders and killing them. It would take very little effort, considering he had the Raven Talisman to help him. As Leah had said, now that he was here, now that he knew where to go, he could destroy everything. And if he did, he had no doubt that he would be welcomed back into the arms of the Empress, the brave, conquering Prince of Ravens. Whatever crime he had committed would be washed away by such a deed that had not, in 1,000 years, been achieved by a single man, woman, or child. But even that, did he want that? As the night wore on, his mind continued down this path, and what he saw there was red and blood-soaked. Dawn came, and he had no conclusion. He didn't know to where or what he was attached, or to who he owed his loyalty, if he owed loyalty to anyone. Tomaz and Leah had needed a night to think over what they'd felt about whether or not to force him before the Council of Elders and reveal himself. Even they had put their cause above him. He felt alone, so glaringly, obviously alone, even as he knew the fate of 2 nations hung upon what he did in the next few hours. But his anger and his resentment had begun to deepen into hatred. Hatred of what or who he could not say, perhaps of the world. Hatred at the world for making him choose, for constantly demanding that he choose what he wanted and who he wanted to be, right there, right then. And that hatred fed his anger, and his anger turned around and fed the hatred, until in the end he was lost in a spiral of hopeless, unending pain. Let it be, he thought savagely. I have no duty to anyone anymore. There is no one here I care about, no one in the world who truly cares about me. I am the Prince of Ravens. I feed off of death. Let death come, even if it comes for me. So when Tomaz awoke and set the leftover stew over the fire to heat, he asked the big man if he would like to spar. "Certainly," Tomaz said, looking surprised but also excited. "I didn't know you liked to get beaten so often. Would certainly have wounded my pride." The prince smiled at the big man's joke, feeling a true touch of affection for him. It would be good to spar with Tomaz one last time. So, after breakfast, Tomaz led him down the mountainside and into the city of Vale itself. The city, as the prince had seen when they'd entered the valley, was a huge, sprawling thing. And as he walked through it, the chimneys of the bakeries slowly taking their first smoky breaths and the shop windows rubbing sleep from their eyes and opening themselves to customers, he knew that if there was a good place to spend his last day, it was here. Children ran in the streets, herded along by various haggard-looking mothers, and the prince wondered vaguely where they were going. It was still a surprise to him, as it had been in Bainland, that they were allowed out in public, especially before they'd reached puberty. But this was Vale, and the kindred were strange. The prince felt numb to surprise now, in any case. He was just existing. He would make no choices. He would feel nothing. Let the choice be someone else's this time. Let the world decide without him. The sparring arena was on the east side of the city, and as they made their way down the broad street that cut through the center of it all, they passed large buildings that slowly grew in size until they resembled the houses of the Most High, though here they were simply out in the open for anyone to see and approach. The largest of the buildings, at the end of a long, artificial pond, was made of white stone painted with green and gold highlights and framed by columns and sculptures. It had a large, domed roof with a single spear-like flagpole on top, though no flag was raised there today. When they finally reached the sparring arena, the prince saw that it was located amidst a large barracks and training ground. The arena itself was a large stone building, capped by a dome that was painted with various murals of kindred fighters. One of them was a huge bull of a man that looked vaguely like his brother Ramael, but with pure white hair. The Prince of Ravens reached out again and felt the still growing point of light in the back of his head. Somehow Ramael had found his way around the enchantments that had held him at bay for so long. That much was now abundantly clear. The prince wondered idly how, but then let the thought go. It didn't matter. He would take no sides. He would just see what happened. They entered the arena. It was separated into 5 large sections. One main, central area, which was a platform with raised stone seats immediately surrounding it, and 4 smaller areas situated outside that perimeter. "Practice arenas," Tomaz said, nodding to the 4 smaller areas. "Each is for a different weapon. Back corner is archery, back left is axes, hammers, larger weapons, the one to our right is the unarmed ring, and the one on the left is the sword and dagger arena." "Sword and dagger?" the prince suggested. "Wouldn't have it any other way," the big man said with a grin. Together they moved forward. The prince felt oddly at peace. Tomaz pulled out his greatsword Malachi, which he'd brought from the cabin, and then selected and attached a thick leather edge guard that would prevent the blade from slicing. Even guarded, though, the weapon was still a formidable thing, and the prince realized that this would be a much better example of actual combat between the two of them, as opposed to the staves they'd used on the march south. The prince approached the rack of spare practice swords on the side of the sparring platform and looked through them. He'd always fought best with a single-sided long blade, but most of these looked like typical double-edged broadswords. There were 1 or 2 broader blades, a handful of long hand-and-a-half swords, a slew of thin rapiers, a row of daggers of all shapes and sizes, and at the end... The prince reached out and grasped the copper wire-bound hilt of a long, slightly curved, single-sided sword made of a creamy white metal. It was thinner than a broadsword, and slightly longer. The blade was oddly bright, almost shining as it took in the smallest hint of light, amplified it, and threw it back. From different angles it looked alternately like a ceramic antique and a razor-sharp surgical implement. It was an elegant weapon, that much was certain, and it carried with it a haughty, proud air, as if the sword itself knew its value. "Valerium?" the prince asked, turning to Tomaz. He held the sword out for the big man to see, and as he did he felt the extra weight of which Leah had spoken. The sword was a good few pounds heavier than a typical broadsword. "I thought these were valuable. What's it doing here?" Tomaz was looking at the sword curiously, too. "They are valuable. The store of Valyrium is well guarded, but then again, if you're going to use one in real life, then you need to use one in practice, so there's always one or two floating around. Most of the time it's only for ranger or rogue training, but looks like they found a spare since I've been gone. If it's here, you might as well use it. I've never liked it much. The weight is wrong for me. Unlike the girl, steel has always been good enough, and I suspect it always will be. But you should try it. The prince peered closely at it and saw that the blade was sharp, not a practice sword at all. He pointed this out to Tamaz and said as much, and the big man just smiled. You can't dull Valyrium once it's been sharpened, at least not down to the point where it's safe to hit someone with it in the sparring ring. It'll get less sharp, but it will never be dull, no matter how much you use it. Maybe not always sharp enough to kill, but certainly sharp enough to leave a nasty cut. Just throw an edgeguard on it. Let's get going. Will an edgeguard work? The prince asked, eyeing the razor-sharp edge and remembering what Leah had said about the metal. The guard's lined with a thin bit of metal, Tamaz said, tossing him one made for single-edged swords. It's light enough, and it's good to train with a bit of extra weight anyway. The leather's just on the outside, so when I smack you upside the head, you get a bit of a cushioning from the blow. Tamaz grinned evilly and settled himself into a ready stance. The prince slid the guard onto the blade and hefted the sword in his hand. Strange. Now that he was in a ready stance, the sword didn't feel all that heavy. Heavier than a normal sword, perhaps, but in the prince's opinion, most swords were too light anyway. A few people who had come to the arena first thing in the morning were gathering around the slightly raised platform, some of them squatting down to watch while they waited their turn. The prince settled into the opening stance of Tiger Stalks the Deer, the sword held loosely by his side, his right leg forward, but his weight back on the left. Tamaz, seeing this, shifted to Bear Defends the Hill and began to circle to his right. The prince felt a momentary glow of satisfaction knowing that they were both using imperial sword forms. If one had to fight, it might as well be in a civilized manner. The prince began to move as well, circling away from the big man, trying to keep an even distance between them. His mind was blank and controlled. There was no anger, no emotion at all. He was simply reacting. Tamaz changed directions and rushed forward, sword swinging in from the side in a brutal move known only as the Reaping. The prince saw it and, instead of countering, took a single step back, felt the blade pass in front of his chest, and then spun around and moved past Tamaz. The big man turned before the prince could get in a hit, and the greatsword swung once more, upward from the floor. The prince, unable to dodge, brought down the Valyrian blade and met the sword, parried it, and spun away. The sword was solid. The weight of it felt good in his hands. The big man turned again, but before he could approach, the prince closed the distance and sliced for Tamaz's right shoulder. The greatsword parried it easily, but the prince used the energy from the deflected hit to strike for Tamaz's left side, then his head, and then his legs. The white metal sword felt very good. Tamaz counterattacked, bull-rushing the prince and using his side to push him off balance. The prince dashed away, using his greater agility to avoid the giant's sword as it hissed through the air behind him. He feinted left, then dodged right, and came at Tamaz again. Surprise crossed the big man's face. He was used to the prince keeping his distance, but the surprise was gone in an instant, and Tamaz adjusted to the new tactic, using smaller, defter movements to counter the prince, so that he couldn't close distance and get inside the big man's swing. Clawing eagle met rushing river, and the prince's sword glanced off the greatsword yet again, forcing him back. Tamaz followed quickly, sweat glistening on his face, and the prince quickly began to parry, only able to turn aside the greatsword's weight, not able to stop it outright. But the denser white metal, curved as it was a blade made for the dexterous fighter. Graceful enough to maneuver well, yet heavy enough to defend against a larger opponent. And as time wore on, it became slowly but shockingly clear that the prince was holding his own, strength meeting finesse. The fight continued, and soon they were both absolutely drenched in sweat. Neither made a mistake, neither gave ground without turning around and taking it back. But then, finally, Tamaz slipped, just a fraction, as he came forward in another rush, and the prince was on him in an instant. For a moment, Tamaz continued to parry, turning aside the Valyrian blade, but the prince knew he had the upper hand. He also knew that if he made a mistake, Tamaz would seize it, and his advantage would be immediately lost. He gripped the wire-wrapped hilt more firmly, and began making cuts and slashes that were slightly too fast for Tamaz to parry entirely. The man grimaced, and the prince pressed him again, not allowing him the chance to recover. Finally, the Valyrian blade slipped under the greatsword's guard and struck the big man on the thigh. It was a hit that would have won him a point in a bout, but was not a winning blow. Tomaz grunted in acknowledgement and continued to strike back, to parry, to fight. The prince pressed back just as hard, and then his body started to flag. He was exhausted, and the big man, with his enormous strength, could keep going for hours. The prince needed to end this fight, now. He decided to gamble. He used the sword move aptly named Slicing Hands and locked his sword with Tomaz's. For an instant, Tomaz looked confused, and then when he understood, it was too late. The prince let go of his sword and used both hands to strike Tomaz's wrists. The strike numbed the giant's hands, and his sword clattered to the ground. The prince, hands also numb, the giant's bones were harder than rocks, dodged as the big man swung his arms around to grab him. The prince reached down and grasped his sword, just before Tomaz managed to wrap a hand around his own, and, with a final flourish, the prince struck the pressure points in Tomaz's arm, shoulder, and bicep with the flat of the blade. The enormous greatsword fell once more from a hand now devoid of feeling, and the leather guard of the prince's white metal sword came to rest against the big man's throat. For a moment, the two of them remained stationary, and then the prince lowered his sword. Applause came from the area surrounding the practice arena, and the prince turned to see that a crowd had gathered to watch them, many of the onlookers wearing green and gold or green and silver uniforms. The prince assumed that they were the colors of the Vale infantry. "Very well done," Tomaz said, respect coloring his voice. "That's the first time I've been fully disarmed in years." In spite of his wishes, the prince felt a surge of pride at the praise. "Must be getting old," he taunted the big man with a reluctant smile. Tomaz let out a bark of laughter and picked up his greatsword. "Again?" the prince asked. "How about a real fight?" The prince turned to see Leah, standing just outside the practice ring, fingering the hilt of one of her long daggers. "Aren't you supposed to be at home?" the prince asked. "Aren't you not supposed to care?" she retorted, stepping into the ring. Tomaz took a step back, a small smile on his face and an excited light in his eyes. "I don't care," the prince said. "I was just asking." "You've been doing that a lot lately." "Just asking," she said. She unsheathed one of her daggers and began idly paring a nail with it. "You've never let me spar with you before," he said. "Why the change of heart?" "I think you might finally be good enough for me," she said. He couldn't explain it, but he didn't want to do this. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, making up an excuse. He turned and began to walk away, when a snort as loud as an avalanche issued from Tomaz. The big man was openly smirking at him. "How's the arm?" the prince asked. "You have any feeling back yet?" "What's the matter? Scared of a lady?" Leah asked. "Lady? I don't see any ladies here, just you." There was a collective "ooh" from the gathered fighters around the ring, and several laughs. Leah rolled her eyes and made a rude gesture to them that made them laugh harder. She was smiling when she turned to face him again. A thrill went through the prince. She was excited. She wanted to fight him. The prince didn't remember raising his sword, but suddenly he was holding it in both hands. Leah's eyes flashed, and her sauntering step faltered. She was watching him carefully now. Her look of interest had not faded. She drew both daggers, which gleamed cruelly in the bright light of the training arena skylight. She casually slipped 2 small blade guards into place. "You really think you're ready?" she asked. "Or should I take it slowly for you?" Another round of jeers came from the group around the ring, but the prince ignored it. "Call it, Tomaz," he said. "Go!" Tomaz cried immediately. The prince launched himself across the floor, sword flashing. She met him halfway, and in a slightly muffled ring of metal, daggers met sword. They separated and circled each other, both moving to their right. The prince no longer felt the icy coldness he'd felt with Tomaz. Leah always managed to provoke him, no matter what he did. Well, this would shut her up, once and for all. He rushed forward, sword flashing from side to side, the weight of the Valyrian blade perfect for his fighting style. The girl dodged away, daggers flashing. He spun to follow her, and this time managed to force her to engage. He swung for her head, a brutal blow that would have decapitated her in an actual battle, but she ducked it, and the sword sailed over her head. She stepped forward, thrust her daggers at his stomach and chest. Using his momentum, he twisted away, and the daggers passed within inches of striking him. The crowd gave out a loud yell, half cheers and half disappointed groans. The prince tuned them out and retreated back across the arena, studying the girl. She shifted so that she was holding both daggers down by her sides and eyed him too. She was too fast for him, he knew that. He wouldn't be able to beat her the way he'd beaten Tomaz. What she lacked was his reach and the weight of his blade. He shifted into the warrior sword style, blade held high directly over his head, and stepped into the center of the practice arena, watching her circle. She feinted left, then charged him, but before she could close the distance, he brought the sword down, and she only barely dodged to the side. But then she was in his face, and all thought of tactics disappeared as he simply strove to meet her twin daggers with his sword. He didn't know for how long they fought. It seemed like a moment somehow suspended in time. Their bodies spun and their weapons clashed, striking out again and again, neither able to land a blow. They were both panting, gasping heavily, but still moving, unable to stop, caught up in the deadly dance, pushing each other and being pushed in return. And then, out of the corner of the prince's eye, he saw Lorna and David come up next to Tomaz, and a thought passed through his mind. It hit him like a bolt of lightning, and suddenly everything was clear. He knew what the Prince of Oxen was doing, and he knew how he was getting so close to Vale. In his shock, he fumbled a simple parry and found Leah, breathing in gasping pants, with her dagger at his throat, her face an inch away from his. There was a burst of sound, and a large crowd of gathered soldiers cheered Leah's win. A number of rogue and ranger pairs swarmed the arena. One stopped to grasp the prince's hand. Something was said to him, but he didn't hear it. He was looking from David to Lorna to Leah to Tomaz, and back again to David. A tracking spell. It was a blood mage trick, weaved into the making of demons. It was rare because it only activated upon the demon's destruction, and it required the sacrificial death of a blood mage to create the bond. But blood mages who had been moving through the mountain ranges of Rourke must have known that there was a way for exiles to destroy demons. And if the prince knew his brother Ramael, he didn't doubt that the Prince of Oxen was capable of forcing a blood mage to submit to the torturous sacrifice, on the off chance the demon would be fought and destroyed. If the group that the spell latched onto remained in close proximity, then the spell would allow the blood mages to track them from one edge of the world to the other, or through centuries-old enchantments, leading an invading army and a prince of the realm straight toward the city of Vale. At that instant the crowd parted, and there was Leah, beaming at the praise from those around her. She lifted her head, and their eyes met, and the prince realized just how stunning she was when she smiled. It was as if the hard, stony exterior she so often assumed was pulled away, leaving behind just a girl. "A rebel," said a voice in the back of his head, and the Prince of Oxen was coming to kill her. A crack formed in the hard, bitter hate that had encased him the night before. The crack spread, splintering and spiraling outward, and when it reached the edges of his mind, it shattered. Just that easily, the icy stillness that had given him clarity and helped him harden his heart melted and ran, and blood began to pump harder through his veins, and his breathing was faster. He spun on his heel and began moving through the crowd that was still cheering Leah's victory. A victory that would be short-lived indeed if his brother arrived with no warning. He would come here and she would be smiling no more, she would only be... He neared the edge of the large domed building, turned a corner and sank to the ground. His brother was coming. He could feel the energy from the ox talisman shining like a bright red light in his mind, miles away. This was his chance at redemption, if he wanted it. He could claim credit for the tracking spell, claim he'd known that it was in place, that by doing nothing he had helped his brother overthrow the exiled kindred and reclaim the final piece of the empire. But what if it wasn't good enough? What if even that wouldn't please his mother? "It will!" he hissed out loud. The spitting, hateful noise echoed down the corridor. He clutched his head in his hands. Are you a rebel too? Or are you a good and loyal son? Nearly 2 decades of training under the hands of the Empress, the children, and the imperial scholars crashed down on him, blanking out his mind and trying to wipe such a terrible thought out, as if it were an ink blot spreading quickly over a clean piece of parchment. But he couldn't do it this time, and his mind kept working. He was sitting in the very heart of the enemy's capital, welcomed as a friend, welcomed by a people who should have hated him, and had every reason to kill him on sight if they knew him for who he was. His brother was approaching, coming closer with every minute. Every breath he took was a breath wasted if he wished to warn the kindred. But if he remained silent, if he allowed his brother to attack the exiled kindred, it would be the end. There would be no more kindred, there would be no more resistance. The Empire's power would be complete. The Prince of Oxen was not the leader that Ricard was, but the job required no finesse. He was a club, and the city of Vale little more than an overripe fruit. He was ruthless, heartless, concerned only with physical power, conquering, destruction, annihilation of the Empire's enemies. If the Prince of Oxen found this place, marched on it with his army, he would crush them all. This valley, while well hidden, was not defensible against the likes of him. And if I help, the prince thought, I'll be allowed to come home. They'll have to take me back. If I open the gates to let the army in or sabotage the defense with false information or take out the Council of Elders. Chills ran down his back at this final thought. Yes. He'd entertained it wildly the night before, but now, in the light of day, he knew he could truly do it. Strike off the head of the snake, and that would be it. The Prince of Oxen would arrive to find no resistance, and the Prince of Ravens would be hailed as the greatest servant of the Empress the Empire had ever known. He'd be known as the one who made the attack possible, who had infiltrated what could not be infiltrated. But could he betray Leah and Tomaz? Did they deserve it? Of course they do, he told himself. They're lawfully opposing the rule of the Empire. They deserve their fate. The assassination attempt on his 17th name day flickered across his vision. He remembered the slave auction in Bainland. He felt the depths of despair to which he'd sunk in the bowels of the Seeker's lair. He saw again in his mind's eye the scars that covered Leah's body. Leah Goldwyn, daughter of the exiled kindred, spellblade, Eshendai, traitor, rebel, criminal, outlaw, wanted for conspiracy to overthrow the Empire, the crime for which was death so gruesome that— No, a tiny voice said, forcing the litany to stop. He wanted to remain stoic. He wanted to blot out all emotion, but a single tear traced a line from the corner of his eye, down his cheek, and along the line of his jaw. Slowly, it fell, and by the time it had reached the ground, he was on his feet and moving. He had made up his mind, once and for all. A quick surge of energy, and he was moving down the corridor, purpose lending the strength and speed of determination to his movements. As he made his way back toward the arena, his mind worked ceaselessly, counting cracks in the wall, noticing tiny defects, anything to keep from thinking too deeply about what he was about to do. He rounded the corner and saw that the crowd gathered around Leah had mostly died down, though there were still some asking her questions about her technique. David and Lorna had disappeared. Good. They would only get in the way. The prince began to move toward Leah, but stopped, catching sight of a looming figure off to the side, sitting in the shadows honing an enormous greatsword with an equally large whetstone. The prince changed course and made for Tomaz. Well, Raven, the big man said, what did you think of— The mountainous man trailed off into silence as he met the prince's gaze. Surprise and wariness, combined with the barest hint of fear, crossed the large, bearded face. Where are the elders meeting? The prince asked, without preamble. Tomaz's eyebrows rose. Why would you need to know that? There's no time to explain, Tomaz, he said, pitching his voice low so that people couldn't overhear them. You need to trust me. The prince was surprised at how controlled and emotionless his voice came out, considering the turmoil going on inside him. The council cannot be interrupted, Tomaz rumbled slowly, confusion drawing his eyebrows down and close together as he looked at the prince as if seeing another person. The prince allowed a small hint of his anger and anxiety to show through. I don't have time for that, Tomaz. I need to see them now. A few nearby kindred turned to look at the two of them, wondering what was happening. Leah excused herself and began to approach. Why? Tomaz asked. Tomaz, he said, I need you to trust me. For an eternal moment, the prince waited for the ex-blade master to respond. The big man was quite clearly thrown off balance. Trust and loyalty warred with suspicion, and the prince could see that the giant needed one more nudge. Banking on the big man's over-reliance on loyalty to make the decision for him, the prince played his final card. You once told me I didn't have to be one of the children if I didn't want to be, he said. Do you still believe that? Tomaz's expression froze, and his eyes stared holes in the prince's head. Take me to them, Tomaz. They need to see me. Now. The two of them stared at each other, locked in a frozen tableau for a long moment, and then the big man nodded, stood, and moved quickly off toward the arena door, the prince following close behind him. As he passed the rack of practice swords, he pulled out the Valyrium sword's sheath, quickly slid the blade inside, and tied it to his belt. "Tomaz? Raven?" they heard Leah call in confusion. The two of them, Tomaz in front, burst out of the double doors onto the brightly lit street, sun shining down in cracks through the tall trees that grew on either side of the long, broad boulevard. "Follow," was all Tomaz said. They took off down the main street through the center of the sprawling valley city. Tomaz was moving so quickly, his large strides nearly 3 of the prince's, that the prince was hard-pressed to keep up without running. They passed between men, women, and children, who all gave them a brief, curious glance and then continued walking when they recognized Tomaz. Their expressions clearly showed what they were thinking. Tomaz was an Ashandel. If he was moving quickly, he had a reason for it. They approached the large building the prince had seen when they had first come through the town, made of white stone and green and gold columns amidst beautiful sculptures. Tomaz turned toward it, and the prince followed him quickly, passing large, cultivated trees and a small fountain made of a man spouting water from an upward-reaching hand. Quickly, they made their way past the silver and green liveried guards at the doors, who stepped aside with a nod to Tomaz, though they eyed both his greatsword and the sword sheathed at the prince's side with suspicion. Inside were 3 huge staircases, 2 going up and branching off to the right and left, and one equally grand, but descending, straight down through the floor into the living rock of the valley. It was down this 3rd flight of stairs that they made their way, moving past various groups of men and women who looked to be going about rather important official business. The stairway curved twice, all the while descending, going so far down that the prince soon realized they were quite possibly further underground than most buildings were above. Finally, they came to a long hallway, at the end of which could be seen a large door carved with majestic beasts and meditating men and women. There was a green and gold embroidered black carpet running the length of the hall, and burning torches had been lit and placed in brackets every few yards. At the end of the corridor stood 8 kindred, in formal uniforms of green and gold over tight-fitting black clothing that covered their arms, legs, and neck. 4 had the insignia of a white sword sewn into their high collar, and 4 the insignia of a white dagger. "Brothers and sisters," Tomaz called as they neared, "stand down!" The 8 guards, what the prince suddenly realized were 4 rogue or perhaps ranger pairs, spread across the corridor and seemed not at all inclined to do as Tomaz suggested. "Who comes to the council?" a wiry man with a shock of white hair asked. He had stepped forward and unsheathed a pair of remarkably thin swords, which nonetheless had razor-sharp edges that gleamed dangerously in the light of the burning torches. There was a dagger on his high collar. "One who brings urgent news, Ashandai," Tomaz said, stopping with the prince a few yards away. The prince shifted closer to the big man's left side and put a hand behind his back, under his shirt, resting it on the hilt of his hidden dagger. His other hand he kept on the hilt of the Valyrian sword, sheathed by his side. There was a sudden noise from outside the room, back where the staircase ended. It was the sound of steel on steel. Immediately, 2 of the pairs loped past Tomaz, drawing their various weapons and heading for the door. Tomaz and the prince exchanged a glance. The prince nodded toward the door back to the staircase, his message clear. "Draw them off." Tomaz stared at him, truly realizing for the first time that the prince didn't mean to gain admission, but instead to force it. The prince watched the conflict in Tomaz's face, and then the giant gave the barest hint of a nod. "You 2, with me," he said, motioning to the 3rd pair. He turned and ran for the door, not waiting to hear their response. For a moment they stared stupidly at each other, and then they rushed off down the corridor after him. Once they reached the door, they ran through, and it closed behind them with a resounding boom. As soon as the door closed, the prince was in motion, dashing forward as the dagger came out from beneath his shirt, blade flashing in the torchlight. The Ashandai fell first, not even knowing what had hit him. The Ashandel spun around, only to see a dagger fly through the air and strike him squarely between the eyes. The sword fell from his fingers and hit the ground with a clatter, followed closely by the loud thump of his body. The prince retrieved the dagger and replaced it at his waist. Next, he pulled out the Valyrian sword. It felt heavier than it had in the arena, and the prince knew that had nothing to do with the sword's actual weight. He turned toward the door. There were 2 keyholes and no visible door handle. One keyhole was made of gold, the other of silver, both large but simple in design. A glimmer of light caught the prince's eye, and he saw a large golden key hanging around the neck of the Ashandai, having come out of the man's tunic when he fell. The prince ripped it off and then quickly found the matching key, silver, on the body of the Ashandel. He rammed the keys into their holes and turned them simultaneously, arms stretched wide to either side. The wide double doors cracked open, producing a rush of air that sputtered the torches in the hallway. He pushed, and the doors opened inward, on oiled hinges. On the other side of the door was a large, circular room made from the living rock of a subterranean cave, high-roofed as well as wide. An enormous round table of polished oak was set in the center, around which sat 12 men and women, each equidistant from the next, with a single empty chair to the side. All of them turned to look at who had disturbed their conclave as the doors crashed closed behind the prince. He stepped forward, the Valyrian blade hanging heavily from his clenched fist.